The silent room grew too quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made people shift in their chairs, not because they were uncomfortable physically, but because something about the silence made them uneasy. The ceiling lights buzzed faintly, above hundreds of heads, and the soft clinks of water glasses against polished wood tables echoed like tiny alarms in the distance. Everything in the room looked expensive. Everything felt important. Every single person sitting in that hall had achieved something big tech founders, CEOs, investors, professors. They had flown in from New York, Berlin, Tokyo, Mumbai, Cape Town, all to be here. They had come to witness the minds that shaped the future. And today, the keynote speaker was Sundar Pichai. And yet, Sundar Pichai stood on that stage, having just told one. His voice had been steady, his smile subtle, a kind of warm expression that invited you in gently. But after the final word, the joke left his mouth. The air stood still. No laughter. No cough. Not even a sympathetic chuckle, just silence. 4, 5 seconds. Maybe 10. It stretched long enough to become awkward. And Sundar stood there, still smiling, still calm, like he had rehearsed this moment. The moderators didn't know what to do. Cameras zoomed in. A few people raised their eyebrows. One man near the front shook his head very slightly, as if to say, why would he do that? No one expected Sundar Pichai to joke, especially not here. This was the World Innovation Summit, a global gathering of leaders in artificial intelligence, climate technology, and next-gen computing. The stage was tall, the lights harsh, the audience elite. And yet, Sundar, CEO of Google, soft-spoken engineer from Chennai, had opened his keynote not with a chart or a quote or a statistic, but with a joke. But why? To understand that moment, why he smiled despite the silence, why the joke even mattered, you'd have to go back. Not just a few days or even a few years. You'd have to go back to when Sundar wasn't CEO. You'd have to go back to when he was just a boy in a small apartment in Chennai, lying awake at night, staring at a slow-moving ceiling fan, listening to the hum of distant trains, wondering if his thoughts could ever matter to the world. Because for Sundar, it was never about being the smartest in the room. It was about understanding the room itself, that asterisk, the fan, that never stopped long before Silicon Valley. Long before the polished shoes and keynotes and bright screens, there was a narrow street in Chennai with houses stacked like books in a shelf. They leaned against one another as if the walls needed comfort just like people did. Sundar's family lived on the second floor of a modest building, in a home where every corner had a purpose. Space was tight, dreams were large. His father, Raghunatha, was a quiet man who worked as an electrical engineer. He rarely spoke unless needed, but when he did, Sundar listened. His mother, Lakshmi, was a stenographer who had given up her job to care for Sundar and his brother. She was warmth, always humming, always finding a way to make little things feel like luxuries. And then there was Sundar, curious, skinny, often barefoot, with eyes that always looked just past the present. They had one telephone in the house. It wasn't theirs, it was shared with neighbors. And yet Sundar became obsessed with it, not because of the calls, but because of the numbers. He could remember any number after hearing it once, not just local numbers, country codes, international, prefixes, long strings of digits. They clung to his mind like melodies. It didn't take long for the neighbors to start relying on him. Sundar, do you remember the number for Uncle Ramesh in Delhi? Yes, Auntie. It's 0112-4-5-8-9-3-2. You didn't write it down? He would shake his head gently. No need. But this ability, though praised, made him different. Some of the other boys didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't athletic. He didn't tell jokes. He didn't interrupt the teacher or make fun of others to get attention. He was polite, quiet, and in a world where noise often wins, silence can feel like weakness. Still, Sundar watched everything. He watched how his father came home every evening, tired, but never complaining. He watched how his mother measured rice carefully so It would last the whole month. He watched how the ceiling fan turned slowly during power cuts, its blades coasting on the last bit of stored motion. He stared at that fan a lot, especially at night. When he couldn't sleep. Sometimes, when the heat was too much and the electricity had gone out again, he would sit by the window, pressing his cheek against the iron bars, hoping for a breeze. He would look up at the stars and think not about where he was, but where he could be. He didn't have a plan. He didn't even know what Google was back then, but he had something else. He had a question inside him that never went away. What? If I'm meant to do something, but I don't know what it is yet. Asterisk, the wrong answer. Sundar sat quietly in the third row of his classroom. Notebook open, pencil ready, but his thoughts were not in the room. The teacher's voice was echoing faintly in the background, talking about the laws of motion. But Sundar's mind had drifted back to something he had seen that morning. A newspaper, crumpled and half wet on the road, with the headline about a satellite launch failure. It had been just one sentence, but it stayed in his mind like a splinter. Something about failure had always fascinated him. Not the drama of it, not the headlines. It was the silence that followed, questions people didn't ask. The days after, when everyone had moved on, except the people who failed. Pichai. The teacher called suddenly, and Sundar blinked. Can you answer the question? He stood up slowly. His classmates turned. Some smirked. One boy whispered something under his breath, and another laughed. Sundar looked at the chalkboard. The question was written there clearly. Explain Newton's second law. His mind, usually sharp, suddenly went blank. He could feel the heat behind his ears. The pressure wasn't the question. It was the weight of eyes. Sundar said quietly. It's force equals mass times acceleration. Correct. The teacher nodded, but her voice held no praise. And what does that mean in practice? He tried to explain. He started talking about bicycles, about pushing objects, about resistance. His words came out in soft bursts, not loud enough for the back of the room to hear. Halfway through, someone coughed loudly, on purpose. The teacher cut him off. Sit down. He sat. His chest felt tight. It wasn't the wrong answer, but it wasn't the right delivery. Not confident. Not strong. And in that moment, Sundar realized something that would haunt him for years. Sometimes it's not what you know. It's how you make others believe you know it. After class, while walking home, Sundar stayed behind the crowd. His bag felt heavier than usual, though there was nothing extra in it. His legs moved slowly. He replayed the moment over and over in his head. How he hesitated, how they laughed, how the teacher dismissed him. When he reached home, his mother was in the kitchen, humming. The smell of tamarind rice filled the air. She looked up and smiled. You're early. He didn't answer. She noticed. Mothers always notice. What happened? He hesitated. I gave the right answer, but I think I said it the wrong way. She wiped her hands and came to sit beside him. Sometimes the world listens only when the voice is loud, she said softly. But that doesn't mean the quiet voice is wrong. The window to the world, it was a small moment, barely noticeable, that changed the direction of Sundar's life. One afternoon, when he was 16, his father brought home something he had never seen before. A battered second-hand computer magazine. The pages were curled. Some were missing. The colors had faded. But for Sundar, it might as well have been a spaceship manual. He opened it on the floor and stared at diagrams of circuits, processors, tiny chips that lived inside boxes called motherboards. His father watched him from across the room, smiling faintly. I thought you'd like it, he said. Sundar didn't. Look up. He was already gone into the language of silicon, of logic gates and binary, of machines that could think faster than humans. He didn't understand everything on those pages. Not at first, but he didn't stop reading. He traced the lines with his finger. He reread sentences until they made sense. He looked up words in the dictionary, asked his teachers quiet questions after class, and even walked across town to a government library where he could sit on the floor for hours. Reading old books with cracked spines. The world of technology didn't feel distant to him. It felt like a map one he could walk, even if slowly. His parents noticed the change. He talked less but thought more. He became quiet not out of fear, but focus. When he wasn't studying, he was sketching ideas, diagrams, little machines. He imagined tools to help people. He had no tools to build them, but he drew them anyway. It was the dreaming that mattered. One day, during a power cut, Sundar sat by the window again, just like he had as a boy. But this time, he wasn't looking. Up at the stars, he was holding that same magazine, flipping to a page about Silicon Valley. It showed a photo of men in jeans and sneakers, standing in front of glass buildings, smiling. They didn't look like movie stars. They didn't look like kings. They looked ordinary, and yet they were changing the world. He stared at the image, then at the dark sky beyond the window. Something clicked inside him. Not a voice, not a vision, just a quiet truth that settled deep in his chest. You don't need to look. Extraordinary to do something extraordinary. He didn't tell anyone that night, but he made a decision. He was going to find his way to that place. Not just the physical place, the world where ideas were currency, where minds, not volume, held the power. He didn't know how, but he would find a way. Asterisk the edge of enough years later, Sundar stood at. The edge of a campus he had only seen in pictures. The air smelled different. The trees were older, but pruned and perfect. He looked down at the papers in his hand admission documents, a housing form, a campus map, but none of it felt real. Not yet. Not even as the gates of Stanford University stood open in front of him like a portal to another life. Everything had changed. And nothing had. His heart still raced the way it did during oral exams back home. His hands still curled into nervous fists when people looked at him too long. And his suitcase? It was still secondhand, the corners worn soft like fabric instead of leather. Inside, he had packed the same magazine his father gave him years ago. It was old now, more brown than white, but he kept it between two books so it wouldn't bend. His first few months in America were hard in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the language. He had studied English for years. It was the speed of it. People spoke like thoughts were on fire. Questions came fast. Jokes came faster. And Sundar, though capable, always seemed half a step behind in conversation. He often smiled at things he didn't fully understand. He said yes when he meant maybe. He asked people to repeat themselves more times than he was comfortable with. And money was a ghost that followed him everywhere. Every cup of coffee, every bus ride, every used textbook was a calculation. He lived with 3 other students in a small apartment, shared a room with a roommate who played loud music late into the night, and often went to bed hungry, telling himself it was just jet lag. But he didn't complain. Instead, he found comfort in routines. He walked the same path to class each day. He always sat in the second row. He took notes, not just on lectures, but on the way professors asked questions, how other students answered, how debates unfolded. He studied the room again just like he did as a child. He was still quiet. But this time, the silence was by choice. One night, after weeks of struggle, Sundar called home. The line crackled. It cost almost everything in his pocket for that few minutes. Appa, he said softly. I'm trying, but it's hard. There was a pause. Then his father replied, you don't have to be the loudest voice in the room. Just make sure when you speak. It means something. Asterisk, the laugh that changed everything. The room was still quiet. Sundar stood on the stage. The spotlight warm on his face. The silence stretched tight like a string pulled at both ends. He had told the joke. A gentle one. Not sarcastic. Not mean. Just a small story about misreading an email from an intern. Something simple. Something human. But no one laughed. And yet, Sundar didn't step back. He didn't flinch. Because this wasn't the first time silence had stared at him. He knew this moment wasn't about the joke. It was about what came after. He let the silence breathe. Then, slowly, he leaned into the mic and said, when I first came to America, I didn't laugh much either. Not because I didn't find things funny, But because I was always trying to punchline, and by the time I got it, everyone had already moved on. This time, a ripple moved through the room. A few smiles, a chuckle dot, then laugh from somewhere near the back dot, and just like that, the silence broke, but Sundar didn't smile yet. He waited, then he spoke again. This time, no joke. Just honesty. When you grow up believing your voice is too soft, too slow, or too unfamiliar, you learn to listen deeply. You learn to notice what isn't said. And in that quiet space, you begin to find your own way of being loud. The room listened now, not with politeness, but with attention. He continued, I've failed interviews. I've said the right answers the wrong way. I've been overlooked, doubted, and told to speak up. And sometimes, yes, I stay quiet. But silence doesn't mean fear. Sometimes it means focus. Sometimes it means patience. And sometimes it means waiting. Waiting until the moment is truly yours. He paused, then he smiled. Today, I lead a company where people use their voices every day to search, to learn, to connect. And still, I believe some of the most powerful things we do begin in silence. There was no silence now. The audience clapped, not just because of what he said, but because they had seen it happen. They had seen someone stand in a moment where laughter didn't come and make meaning anyway. After the speech, as Sundar stepped off the stage, a young woman approached him, nervous, holding her phone like a shield. Sir, she said quietly, I wanted to say, I'm one of those people too. The ones who stay quiet. Thank you for making us feel seen. He smiled and nodded gently. You're not alone, he said. And when your moment comes, take your time. It's okay if no one laughs right away. She smiled, blinking back tears, and as he walked away into the crowd, the applause still fading behind him, Sundar thought of a ceiling fan turning slowly in the dark. And he knew sometimes the quiet ones don't just survive the room. The echo that stayed at the conference ended. The lights dimmed. People stood, stretched, gathered their belongings, but something lingered in the air. Something quiet, like a scent or a song that refuses to leave the room. Sundar had walked off the stage more than an hour ago, yet his words were still floating in the space between exit signs and empty coffee cups. A few attendees stayed behind. Not to network, not to pitch. They simply sat, eyes distant, as if trying to hold on to a feeling they hadn't expected to find at Tech Summit. That Sundar didn't linger. He never liked attention after the applause. Instead, he found a quiet hallway, stepped outside through a side door, and stood alone beneath the sky. The stars were dim behind city light, but he looked up anyway, just like he used to in Chennai. The air was cooler here. Cleaner, but the quiet, it was the same. His phone buzzed. Dozens of messages, articles already being written. Journalists quoting his lines, short clips being shared online. One had already gone viral, but he didn't open any of them. Not yet. Instead, he thought of the young woman who had come up to him. The tremble in her voice, the way she clutched her phone like a lifeline. He had seen himself in her, not the man he was now, but the boy he used to be. The one who sat silently in classrooms. The one who got the answer right, but the delivery wrong. The one who watched fans turn during blackouts and thought about futures that didn't yet exist. And he wondered how many others were out there right now. Not just watching his talk, but living his story. Not yet in boardrooms or spotlights, but in small homes, behind slow computers, in crowded schools. Holding on to dreams that felt ridiculous to say out loud. He remembered something his mother used to whisper when she thought he was asleep. He doesn't speak much, she would tell guests quietly. But when he does, it's like you can feel the whole room change. He never told her he heard that, but it stayed with him. Just like this moment would now stay with others. Inside the building. A janitor swept the hallway. In the lobby, a child tugged at her father's sleeve, pointing to Sundar's face on a magazine. And in living rooms across the world, people replayed his speech. Not for the joke, but for what came after. Not all echoes are loud. Some change. The world softly. Asterisk, the voice behind the silent sign. The days that followed the conference. Sundar's speech was watched by millions. Not because he was famous, he already was. Not because he ran one of the world's biggest companies, he already did. But because something in that moment had cracked through the screen and touched something. Older, something quieter, in people's hearts. It wasn't the joke that made them watch. It was the silence that followed. And the calm that came after. People began sharing their own stories. Introverts, immigrants, students who had once failed oral exams, professionals who never spoke up in meetings, mothers who gave up dreams quietly, sons who never said much at dinner tables. All of them suddenly saw themselves in the man who had once been a boy beneath a ceiling fan, wondering if quiet could ever lead to power. Asterisk, and as the days passed, something unexpected happened. Young engineers from small towns wrote emails they had been too afraid to send. Interns started asking questions in meetings. Team leads began checking in with the quiet ones, not just the loudest voices. Parents started telling their children, it's okay to be soft. It's okay to be slow. It's okay to be you. And Sundar? He noticed, not just in likes and views, but in little things. An intern who once avoided eye contact now knocked on his door with an idea. A security guard at the Google campus stopped him one morning, not for his badge, but to say, my daughter saw your talk. She thinks maybe she can be a scientist now. He didn't try to go viral. He didn't try to inspire. He just told the truth. Asterisk, and that truth had lived with him for years. It lived in late nights with no electricity, in classrooms where his hands shook while speaking, in empty plates at the end of long days in a foreign country, in boardrooms where he had to earn respect without ever raising his voice. It lived in all the moments no one clapped, no one nodded, no one noticed. And now, finally, it was heard. Asterisk. One evening, Sundar sat alone in his office. The sun was setting through the glass. The city below hummed with traffic and ambition. He looked down at his desk. Next to his laptop sat an old, torn magazine. The one his father gave him? He picked it up gently and opened to the page with the photo of men in jeans outside a Silicon Valley office. He looked at their faces, then he looked at his reflection in the glass, and he smiled, not because he had become one of them, but because he hadn't lost himself along the way. Sometimes the voice behind the silence doesn't need to get louder. It just needs the world to finally listen. Asterisk, the lesson in the quiet months past. The world moved on, as it always does. News cycles turned. New headlines came. New technologies were announced. More keynotes were scheduled. And yet, every now and then, Sundar's words still appeared, quoted in articles, whispered in classrooms, shared in text messages between friends who had never spoken openly before. His story had outlived the moment, not because it was about success, but because it was about the journey most people never speak. The journey of being unseen, of sitting in rooms where others interrupt and you don't, of knowing the answer but hesitating to raise your hand, of being told to speak up when you were simply trying to understand. The world often celebrates noise. But Sundar had offered something else, something softer, something slower, a kind of truth that doesn't shout, but stays. He was invited to speak again, more conferences, more panels. But something has shifted in him. He no longer measured impact by applause. He no longer tailored his words to fit expectations. He spoke slowly, intentionally, and when he paused, he let the silence land, not as a mistake, but as a choice, and people listen differently now, not because he demanded it, but because they remembered the first time they heard him and realized that quiet could carry weight. One afternoon, Sundar received a letter, not an email, not a message ping, but a physical letter, handwritten. The ink had smudged slightly in the corner. It was from a young man in Kenya. He had watched the talk on a shared phone in a crowded internet cafe. He wrote, for the first time, I felt like I didn't have to become someone else to matter. I just had to become more of myself. Sundar held that letter for a long time. In that quiet moment, he thought of every ceiling fan, every empty classroom, every mispronounced word, every hand he didn't raise, every time he thought he was behind, They weren't detours, Dot. They were the path. And now, they were the reason someone else somewhere far away had decided not to give up. Dot, the lesson was never about being CEO. Dot, it was about becoming yourself. Fully, without apology, Dot. It was about knowing that even if the room doesn't laugh, even if the room doesn't clap, even if the room doesn't notice right away, you still have something to say, Dot. And when the world finally listens, it won't be because you shouted, Dot. It'll be because you waited. You watched, and you spoke only when it truly mattered, Dot asterisk. The power of one voice years passed again. The speech was no longer trending. The video had been archived into best of lists and educational playlists. New faces had taken the stage. New ideas had caught the world's attention. But something about that moment, that joke, that silence remained not. Because it was loud, Dot, but because it echoed differently. The world had changed since Sundar's childhood. Everything was faster. Algorithms guessed what you were about to type. Voices filled every platform. Everyone was speaking, posting, sharing. And yet, more and more people felt unheard. That's what made his message last. Dot, not the joke. Dot, not even the speech, but the reminder that one voice spoken at the right time, with truth and humility, could still matter in a crowded world. Sundar never tried to go viral again. He kept doing what he always had, listening more than talking, watching more than reacting, giving others space to speak even if it meant stepping back. He mentored in private, helped in quiet ways. His public image remained calm, polished. But those who worked closely with him knew he hadn't changed. He still took time before responding. He still paused before big decisions. He still walked the halls quietly, stopping to ask questions most leaders were too busy to ask. Dot. And in boardrooms across the globe, in classrooms and conferences, people started remembering the value of stillness, the value of intention, the value of one voice, spoken clearly, not loudly, for a purpose. Dot. And that purpose wasn't ambition. Dot. It was connection. Dot. One afternoon, Sundar visited a small school in Chennai. He didn't announce it. There were no cameras, no speeches, just a quiet visit. He sat with a group of students who reminded him of himself, shy, curious, wondering if their thoughts would ever reach beyond the walls of their neighborhood. A girl asked him, "Sir, how do you know if your voice is strong enough?" He looked at her gently. "You don't," he said, "but you use it anyway. And when you do, you'll find you weren't alone after all." She didn't reply, just nodded. Dot. And in her silence, he heard everything. Dot. As he stood to leave, he passed by a fan turning slowly overhead. For a moment, he looked up at it. Dot. Then he smiled. Because sometimes the story doesn't end with applause. Dot. Sometimes it ends with a quiet moment that reminds you you've come full circle. And in that circle, you've made space for someone else to begin.